Hi everyone, welcome to today's 30 on Thursday SharePoint REST Services for Designers. If this is your first time joining us, our 30 on Thursdays webinar series is a bi-weekly 30-minute SharePoint webinar series where we talk about the hottest topics, trends, and products in SharePoint. Our next webinar will be taking place on March 20th where we will be talking about balancing collaboration and compliance. You can register for this webinar and any of our other webinars at sharepoint.protiviti.com/webinars. If you're interested in any online SharePoint training, we do offer a full schedule of topics from SharePoint styling and branding to Nintex workflow and business intelligence. You can see our full schedule at sharepoint.protiviti.com/training. Kyle will be teaching a styling and branding course next week, March 11th and 12th. If you're interested in learning more about SharePoint design, it'll be focused on SharePoint 2013 styling, branding, and responsive design. You can learn more about this class at sharepoint.protiviti.com/training. Protiviti will be hosting our 7th annual SharePointConference.org in Reston, Virginia and Dallas, Texas this year. We offer pre- and post-conference full-day workshops as well as sessions targeted towards business users, technical users, and UX professionals. We're offering a 15% off discount for anyone on this call. Please use 30T15 when registering at SharePointConference.org. Today's session is being recorded. An archived of all of our past sessions is located on our website. We have over 40 recordings now, so you can see this session and all of our other sessions on our website as well. For questions today, please insert them in the GoToMeeting window, and we will try to get to all of them at the end. So the topic for today, again, is SharePoint REST Services for Designers. Presenter is Kyle Schaeffer with Protiviti, and I am Julia Oates, and I will be moderating today's session. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Kyle so we can get started.
Great. Thanks, Julia. And good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is Kyle Schaeffer here. I do design and user experience work in SharePoint, and as Julia mentioned, we're going to be talking about a specific feature in SharePoint that I've really gotten into lately called SharePoint REST Services. Now, if this is something that you've never used before, this is going to be a little bit of an introductory. I'm not going to show any slides or anything. It's basically just I want to show you guys a demo of what it is you can do with these REST services. I think they're kind of a thing that, as a designer, I'm not really technical. I don't get into programming and code that often. But once you realize that these options are there and that they're available for you to use in your design work, it sort of opens the door for you to do a lot more flexible things and interesting things with your SharePoint environment. So as you can see on the screen here, I have a SharePoint 2013 environment that we're going to be working in. But I do want to point out that the SharePoint REST services are also available in SharePoint 2010 as well. So regardless of which platform you're on, if you're in Office 365, if you're on-premises SharePoint 2013, or even if you're using an older version, at least, at the very least, a subset of these features are going to be available in your own SharePoint environment. So if you've never used web services or specifically REST web services in any web platform, essentially what they are is they are an endpoint that you can send a request to, and they send you back information about whatever it is that you're requesting. So for instance, what we're going to be looking at today is I want to send out a request to my SharePoint site and say, hey SharePoint, what is the list data that's in this particular list that I'm interested in? Or, you could go out to SharePoint and pull back search queries. You could go out to SharePoint and find pages and find images and content throughout your site. But the advantage of using these REST services is that you're not tied to using a specific web part to do that inside of SharePoint. Typically, if you wanted to do something in SharePoint, like go out and find some pages somewhere, you're going to have to use one of the web parts that SharePoint gives you by default, like the content query web part, or if you have SharePoint 2013, they have the new content by search web part. These things are very useful tools, but they do limit you in some ways because you kind of have to work within the confines of the way that those web parts were designed and set up. The great thing about web services is that you can go out and get any SharePoint list data or library data. You can bring it back to your page, and then you can manipulate it any way you want. So this is why I call this session Rest for Designers, because I want to show you guys how to take normal list data that you work with, normal SharePoint information, and manipulate it to look like anything you want it to look like. And this is going to be a little bit technical, so if you're not into programming, I would say don't pay attention so much to the individual things that I typed in, and I'll try to give you guys some resources to go out and help learn this stuff. But I think more importantly, just through understanding the big picture of what it is that we're doing, and that's going out to SharePoint, making a request, and then doing something with that information that we get back. So in order to get started, what we're going to do is I already have a site, a sub-site here that I set up. I just called it REST. You can see I have a page here that says REST Services Demo. And the way that the web services work in SharePoint is you're going to interact with them using JavaScript. So in order for me to actually do that, we first have to make this page so that I can insert JavaScript and start writing code into the page. The easiest way to do that, in my opinion, I've been doing this quite a bit lately, is I usually like to use SharePoint Designer to do my code editing. And what I'll do is I'll create an HTML file that I can edit in SharePoint Designer, and I'll just insert it into this content area here. And this is actually really useful to do stuff like this, because then you don't have to do your code editing in the browser. You can actually do it in a code editor like SharePoint Designer, which is a little more useful. So I'm going to start just by going into our master page gallery in SharePoint Designer. And if you've never used SharePoint Designer, it's pretty easy. It's essentially just a code editor. And the master page gallery is going to have to drill down to a couple folders. One's called _catalogs master page. And then essentially this is just a place where you can put files related to the design and the user experience and the front-end development of your SharePoint master page or your SharePoint design, whatever it is that you want to call it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right-click here, and I'm going to go to New, and then HTML. You'll see HTML is an option there. And it's going to create a new file. It's going to ask me to give it a name. I'm going to call this dashboard.html and hit Enter. And then I can double-click on that and click on Edit File here to actually open it up. And I've made the text nice and big, so hopefully you guys don't have any trouble reading this. I'm actually going to delete the contents out of this file and just put in one line there that says inside of an H1 tag. And this is just an HTML file, so I'm not doing anything SharePoint specific so far. I'm just going to type hello into this H1 tag here and save my changes. So the only thing we've done so far is just create a new HTML file. So now what I want to do is I actually want to insert that HTML file into the center area of the page. And we can do that using a content editor web part. So I'm going to go here and edit the page. And I'm going to go down to one of these web part zones. I'll just use this one that says header. It's nice and big. Gives me plenty of room. And I'm going to add a web part. And under media and content category, you'll see the first one there is called content editor. Allows authors to enter rich text content. And there's one unique feature about this web part. You'll see when I add it to the page here, if I use the little context menu and click on Edit Web Part, it's going to allow me to edit the settings of this web part in this tool pane. You'll see the very first option there. It says Content Link. To link to a text file, type a URL. And this is actually what we're going to use to pull in that HTML file and place it on this page. So if you look in SharePoint Designer, you'll see it at the top here, there's a path, and it says /sites/kschaeffer/_catalogs master page dashboard.html. So we essentially just have to give SharePoint, this web part, the path to that file. So I'm going to type in that path there, just the path to that HTML file. And I'm also going to go under here and I'm going to give this web part a title. We're going to call it dashboard. And I'm going to set the Chrome type to none, which is essentially just going to remove the title and the spacing around the web part to give us a little more room. And you'll see if I go ahead and publish my page here, now the only thing we have on our page is that the contents of that HTML file. And the reason why I like to do it this way is now that we have this set up, I can click in here in my file and I could make a change, I could save that change, and I could very quickly switch back to the browser and refresh the page, and it's immediately going to reflect my changes here. I don't have to constantly check in, check out, edit page, save page. This is going to be a much faster workflow, and it kind of separates the code from the page itself, which is kind of nice. It makes it reusable and portable. It's kind of like creating your own web part, if you will, but just doing it through an HTML file. So now that we've set this up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually insert some JavaScript here because, again, we want to use those web services in SharePoint to actually go out and get information. So the first thing I'm going to do, we don't need this hello message. That was really just to make sure that that was working and we typed in the correct path. The first thing I want to do is, in order to actually make a request in JavaScript, you have to do what's called an AJAX call. So you're essentially telling JavaScript to make a web request out to a certain address, a web address somewhere out there on the internet, and get information back. But to do that, you actually have to use AJAX, which can be a little bit difficult to work with. But if you've ever used the library jQuery, it actually makes that process much easier. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to attach jQuery and just drop it into this HTML file. And this is a file, a JavaScript file that you could download. One place I like to use this is Google actually has a hosted version of this file that they make it really easy. All you have to do is take, this path right here, and they show you this is how you attach jQuery. And you can actually use that file that's hosted out on Google's server, which is a little bit faster. So I'm just going to paste that in here and hit save. And the only thing that does is it makes jQuery is now available for me to use inside of this page here. And so what I can do now is I can actually start writing JavaScript inside of this HTML file, and I can make use of that jQuery library. Now, I'm not expecting anybody on the call to memorize exactly how to make a jQuery call in SharePoint. There's a little bit to it. You kind of have to get started and read some blog posts to help you understand the syntax of how you write these requests. And I'm actually going to share with you now. I'm going to throw this into the chat box of, let me make sure I send that out to everyone. Oh, for some reason, everyone is not an option. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll just copy this here, and hopefully you guys can see that. You can get to this from kyleschaeffer.com. For some reason, the chat box isn't letting me send out a message to everyone. It says organizers only. I don't know why. But if you guys just go to kyleschaeffer.com, it's just my first and last name, you'll see that there's a blog post, right? It's the second post on the page there, creating new SharePoint interfaces using REST. And it's kind of the basis for what we're talking about here. But the nice thing about this post is it actually gives you a little template for working with these web services in SharePoint. So you'll see right here, they have this little template, and it says .ajax, and that's actually that jQuery format for making a web request. So I'm actually just going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it into my script block here. And let's take a look at what we're actually doing here. So in jQuery, when you say .ajax, you're basically saying, okay, in JavaScript, go out and make a request. Send out a request to this address. And you'll see the address is this URL column here. And that's basically how SharePoint lets you decide where you're getting your information from. So in this case, the address of my site is actually /site/kschaeffer. So I actually want to go to /sites/kschaeffer. I'm going to type that into the URL. And you'll notice here too, in my web browser, I'm on a subsite called /rest. So depending on where you're getting this information from, you just want to make sure that you're typing the right path to that site, your SharePoint site that you're actually pulling this information from. And then the way it works is you have these special words and parameters that you put into this request URL that tells SharePoint what information you're actually going to get back. So by default, what it's doing is it's going to this folder called _API/web/lists/get-by-title-pages/items. And what that is actually going to do is it's going to go out to my REST subsite that's already in SharePoint. It's going to go to the web services, which is what this little URL here is. It's going to go to the lists endpoint, which basically means I want to get list data back. It's going to find a list with a name of pages, which is the pages library. It comes with any publishing site. And then it's going to bring back all the items from that list. So basically, depending on how you set up this request URL, you're going to get different information back from SharePoint. I'm not going to make any changes at all other than just typing in the correct address here. And I'm going to go ahead and hit the save. And we'll go back here and we're going to refresh. Now, you'll notice when we refresh, nothing actually appears on the page, and that's because in the code, the only thing it did when I went out and I make this request is it did this little function called console.log_data. And what that is it's going to spit out all of the information that it got back from SharePoint into the console of my web browser. And if you've never used the console, it's usually going to be the F12 key on your keyboard to bring up the developer tools. And you'll see down, I'm using Google Chrome, you'll see there's a console tab here. And if I leave that open and refresh the page, you'll see a new line actually appears in the console. It says Object D. And this is kind of like a little tree view. You can actually click on a little triangle to explore these different things. But if you actually really start to look into it, you'll notice that you have all this information that SharePoint is sending back. And this is that data that we're getting back from SharePoint. We're getting back information. And a lot of it might look like nonsense, but you'll notice here it says title REST services demo. That's actually giving me the title of my page, which shows up right here. You'll see if I scroll up a little bit, it says created, and then there's a date and a time there. So it's actually giving me information about the files or the list items, and it's sending that back to me in JavaScript. And if you actually look here, there's a second example on this blog post. It's a little more useful because it's actually going to do something with that data. It's not just going to spit it out into the console, which isn't entirely useful. So I'm going to do the same thing here, sites Schaeffer/rest. But here, instead of console.log, it's doing a little jQuery function here, and it's basically going to write out some HTML to our page. And it's saying this.title and this.modified. So it's essentially getting the title of each page in my pages library, and it's getting the modified date of each item there. And if we save and refresh here, you'll see, there it is right there. It's actually finding that information and outputting it on the page. Now the cool thing about this is once you get this set up, you can start playing around with this script to get different information back. So for instance, we have I set up a list on this site called projects, just a custom list in SharePoint, and if I click on it, you'll see it has some information in it. It has, basically it's going to be budget information for different projects that you might be running. So we have a client, Microsoft, and we're doing an intranet design for them. They have 100 hours budgeted, but we burned 75 thus far. So it's a list just called projects, has some information in it. But the cool thing is here, now I can go into my web request URL and I can say, go and find get by title projects. So instead of the pages list or library, I want to get a list or library called projects and get all the items back from it. So if we save there and we refresh, we go back to our REST page and refresh, you'll see now we're getting different information back. We're getting intranet design, public website, store portal, and team site. And we're getting when they were modified, the date and time that they were modified for each item that comes back. And this is where it actually gets a little more interesting with things you can do, because now that you have this information and it's being output to your page, you can go into this code and you can say, you know what, maybe instead of an H2, I want this to be an H1, and save our changes and refresh, and all of a sudden we have a different style that's on our page here. Or maybe we want to put something around this that says div style equals background is DDD width 10M float left. So again, I'm just typing in some HTML here, you know, and some CSS styles to do with it, but what it's going to do is it's actually going to allow us to start to really customize the way this content looks as it's output on the page. If we want to go back, we can tweak this. Maybe we want to do, you know, width is 20M, height 20M, margin 0, 1M, 1M, 0. So this is actually going to create kind of a tiled look to each of these things that appears on the page. So you can see really quickly what I'm doing is I'm just pulling in list data from SharePoint, but I'm creating my own interface using this format, which becomes a really eye-opening thing. Once you start to get into this, you can realize all these different things that you could build that you couldn't necessarily do very easily before. And we're just building all this using JavaScript. Again, I know that not everybody is a programmer. This might look like complete nonsense to you if you've never done JavaScript. But the truth is you can copy a template, and if you understand HTML and CSS, you can essentially interact with your information using this format, and you can build HTML and CSS any way you want to create an entirely unique interface in SharePoint. And you can get a lot more than just the title and the modified date here as well. One of the reasons I like to use this line that says console.log data, and I'll show you, I'm going to put that back in there and hit save, is if you look at that console and you start to dig down into these results that you get, you'll notice that there's a lot of information you can get. So I can see here there's a property called client, and it says Microsoft right there. So there's some information I could pull in if I want to. There's another property called hours, and then there's another property called budget. So you can actually pull all that list data and do anything you want with it. So, and all you have to do is in this code down here, I can say, you know, maybe if we want it to be plus. So let's add the client name first of all, this.client plus, and then we'll do a slash, and then we'll put the project, well, let's put the client name in bold. So I'm just going to put a strong tag around the client, right? And if I save, now I'm tapping into new list data. I'm saying this.client, which is actually going to pull that client column and show me it's Microsoft/Intranet Design. Or if we want to do, instead of modified, we can do this.hours of this.budget hours burned thus far. So I'm writing out my own sentences and formatting here, and you'll see now what it's doing is saying 75 of 100 hours burned thus far. And if you wanted to, you could do math calculations on this. You know, JavaScript sort of opens the door to do all kinds of new things with this information, which is pretty eye-opening, and it's pretty empowering. If you can really start to use this information, you realize a lot of different things that you can do with this stuff. So unfortunately, with the format that we have, I don't really have time to show you guys anything more advanced than just doing a basic thing like this, but what I will show you is what you can do with this if you take it a little bit further. This very same example that we're doing right here where we have project budgets, I actually have a fully detailed version of that, and it's the exact same list data, just a different list that I had set up, and you'll see it's kind of similar to what we did before, except we have these little dials, and I'm actually building a dashboard in SharePoint based on list data. So, and you can even click, you know, if I want to see the Microsoft project, I can click here, and it shows me a little light box, and you could have more information in here if you wanted to. So you can really take this further. And the great thing about this is because it's all list-driven data, if I want to add a new tile to this page, all I have to do is go to that list. We have a dashboard list here. I'll hit New Item, And let's have a project called 30 on Thursdays. Client is Protiviti. Budget is 10 hours and 5 hours, let's say 4 hours are spent, and we'll hit save. And as soon as we do that, if we go back to that page, we all of a sudden have a new tile that appears here. And I even set this up to do drag and drop, so you can do all kinds of cool stuff with these interfaces building your own. So that's one example. I'll show you one other example. I know I want to have a couple minutes for questions here, so we'll look at this really quickly. This is the same thing. We have a list with information, but what I did was actually built a PowerPoint-like demonstration of this. And you'll see when I hit Launch Demo, it actually takes me full screen, and this is all SharePoint list data. So this is actually the title of the column of the list item on the left, and there's a subtitle column, and then there's like a rich text column. And then for each list item, if you move your mouse cursor to the edge of the screen, you get a little arrow, and if I click, it's going to go to the next one. And you see there's some information here, and each one of these has a different full detail background image, and you can it's kind of like PowerPoint. I can go left and right to navigate to each of these slides as is built into SharePoint. I don't want to load too many images because it might make my voice break up if I do that. So let me cancel that. But that's just an example of how far you can take this. You can really do a lot of stuff using this technique, and I hope that at the very least I've opened your eyes and allowed you to see some of the features and some of the things that you can do with this technique. So with that, let's go ahead and take a couple questions. I see a couple things have gone through.
Okay, yeah, I did send out the URL, Kyle, to everyone.
Great, thank you very much.
We have a couple questions about the recording. The recording will be available at sharepoint.protiviti.com/archived webinars. So that'll be available by the end of today. One question we have is, does SharePoint 2010 have these capabilities?
Yeah, that's a good question. SharePoint 2010 has web services as well. They're not exactly the same format as they are in SharePoint 2013. But all of this information is available there as well. And I'll actually give you guys a pretty useful link. There's a friend of mine, Mark Anderson. He does some of these training events for us as well. He wrote a solution called SP Services, and I think it's codeplex.com. And it actually, it's basically a jQuery library to interact with these web services in SharePoint, and this has been around since SharePoint 2007. So he's got a lot of really cool features on here. If you guys want to check this out, and maybe if you're not so good with code and you just kind of want a library that does some of these things for you, this is a really, really good library that you can just drop into your SharePoint site, and it does all kinds of cool things to enhance the user experience. So this is spservices.codeplex.com.
Great, thank you. And the other two questions I think refer to the codes that you provide on your website. So if you guys just take a look at your chat box, I did provide the URL to Kyle's website where you can find those links. Is there any other questions?
Okay, great. Well, let me, I'll pull up our final slides here. So there's some contact information in case you guys have questions. You want to reach out to either me or Julia. You can see the information there. And if you come up with a question a little bit later or once you start using this, we're happy to always help and give you guidance where needed. And also, we just want to say thank you. We appreciate everybody taking the time out of your afternoon. And thank you guys so much. We hope you join us for the next 30 on Thursday.